Suitcases have a distinct, hollow sound when they are dragged across hardwood floors, a sound Caleb Harrison would never forget. It was his 18th birthday. There was no cake, no singing, and no celebration. Instead, there was just his stepfather, Richard Dempsey, standing by the front door with a scowl that had been brewing for 5 years, holding Caleb's threadbare duffel bag. "You're a man now, Caleb," Richard said, his voice devoid of warmth. "My obligations are done. Time to make your own way." Caleb looked past the heavy frame of his stepfather, his eyes searching the kitchen for Daisy. His mother was there, standing by the sink, obsessively wiping down a countertop that was already spotless. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. That silence hurt far worse than Richard's cruelty. It was the ultimate confirmation that he was, and perhaps always had been, a burden. With $50 in his pocket and a yellowed envelope stuffed into his jacket, a parting gift from his mother that she had shoved into his hands the night before without a word, Caleb walked out into the biting October wind. He didn't look back. It wasn't until Caleb was shivering on a Greyhound bus heading north toward the rural fringes of Washington state that he finally opened the envelope. Inside was a heavy, rusted brass key and a folded, notarized deed. It belonged to Arthur Pendleton, his biological grandfather on his father's side, a man Caleb had never met. The deed transferred ownership of 22 acres of agricultural land in a place called Oak Haven to Caleb, effective upon his 18th birthday. There was no money, just dirt. When the bus finally left him on the side of a crumbling 2-lane highway, Caleb faced his inheritance. The property, once known as Pendleton Ridge, was a graveyard. Row upon row of skeletal fruit trees stood locked in a suffocating embrace of invasive blackberry brambles and poison oak. The soil was cracked and grey. At the center of the decay sat a log cabin with a sagging roof, broken windows, and a front porch that looked ready to collapse under the weight of a single footstep. Pushing open the front door with the rusted key, Caleb was hit by the stench of mildew, damp wood, and decades of abandonment. There was no electricity, no running water, and only a rusted wood stove for heat. As he sat on an overturned milk crate in the center of the dark room, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the walls, the reality of his isolation settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He had been thrown away, left behind. But as the first rays of dawn broke through the broken window the next morning, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air, a different feeling replaced the despair. It was anger, a deep, burning refusal to be a victim of Daisy and Richard's indifference. This barren wasteland was his, and he was going to make it live again, if only to prove he could survive without them. The first month was an exercise in pure agony. Caleb survived on canned beans and rainwater boiled over the wood stove. His hands, soft from city living, quickly became a landscape of burst blisters, deep splinters, and calluses. He worked from sunrise until he couldn't see his own hands in the dark, hacking away at the relentless brambles with a rusted machete he found in the shed. It was during one of these grueling afternoons, as Caleb was trying to uproot a deeply entrenched dead stump, that he met Silas Whitmore. Silas was a neighboring farmer, a man whose skin looked like weathered saddle leather, and who spoke around a perpetually unlit cigar. He had been watching the young city kid swinging an axe with terrible form for 2 weeks before deciding to intervene. "You're going to snap your collarbone swinging like that, kid," Silas rasped, leaning against the rotting fence line. Caleb paused, wiping sweat and dirt from his forehead, panting heavily. "It's my land. I'll swing how I want." Silas chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. Arthur Pendleton used to say the exact same thing right before he broke a tool. You've got his eyes, but you don't have his sense. Those trees you're chopping down, they aren't dead, they're dormant. You're killing the only valuable thing on this hill. That afternoon, a reluctant mentorship began. Silas taught Caleb the brutal, delicate art of orchard rehabilitation. He showed him how to prune the seemingly dead branches to find the green life struggling inside, how to test the soil's pH, and how to repair the old gravity-fed irrigation lines. Through Silas, Caleb was introduced to Oak Haven's small community. The most crucial introduction was Clara Jenkins, the 20-year-old daughter of the local hardware store owner. Clara was sharp, quick-witted, and possessed a quiet kindness. When Caleb came into the store, practically counting pennies to buy pruning shears and a sack of winter fertilizer, Clara recognized the hollow look of hunger in his eyes. "Tell you what, city boy," Clara said, bagging the supplies. "I'll put this on Arthur's old store account, but you owe me a basket of whatever you manage to grow out of that dirt, and maybe buy me a coffee when you aren't completely broke." Caleb agreed, feeling a strange, foreign flutter in his chest. For the first time in his life, people weren't looking at him as a problem to be solved or ignored. They were looking at him as an investment. By the time the snow melted and spring approached, Pendleton Ridge was fundamentally transformed. The brambles were gone, the soil had been turned and fed, and miraculously, tiny, hesitant green buds began to appear on the gnarly branches of the ancient trees. Caleb had rebuilt the cabin's roof and patched the windows. He was exhausted, achingly thin, but deeply proud. Then, the twist of fate arrived in a silver luxury SUV. Gregory Hayes was a man whose expensive tailored suits looked violently out of place in Oak Haven. He was the owner of Hayes Development Partners, a corporate entity that had been quietly buying up failing farms in the valley to build a sprawling, high-end eco-resort. Hayes found Caleb digging a trench near the property line. "Caleb Harrison," Hayes smiled, though his eyes remained flat and predatory. "I must admit I'm surprised. I expected this place to be foreclosed on by now. You've done a lot of manual labor for nothing." Caleb leaned on his shovel. "This land isn't for sale." "Everything is for sale," Hayes countered smoothly, pulling a crisp manila folder from his briefcase. "But I'm not here to buy. I'm here to collect. Your grandfather, Arthur, took out a substantial private loan from my father 20 years ago. The land was collateral. The interest has compounded. You owe my firm upwards of $300,000. Since you can't pay, I'm here to take possession of the deed." The ground seemed to drop out from beneath Caleb. He stared at the photocopied documents Hayes handed him. The signatures looked real. The legal jargon was impenetrable. "I'll give you a week to pack your bags," Hayes said, turning back to his SUV. "Consider it an act of charity." Panic set in. Caleb took the documents to Silas, who looked them over with a grim expression. "Hayes's father was a loan shark who dressed up like a banker," Silas muttered. "He preyed on farmers having bad years. If this paperwork is legal, kid, you're sunk." That night, as Caleb sat in the dark cabin, staring at the wood stove, his cell phone, which he barely used, buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered it. "Caleb? Sweetie, is that you?" It was Daisy, his mother. Caleb's breath hitched. For a fraction of a second, the terrified, abandoned little boy inside him hoped she was calling to say she missed him, to apologize, to bring him home. "Mom?" "Oh, thank God," she breathed. "Listen, Caleb, a very nice man named Mr. Hayes contacted Richard and me today. He said you're living out in the dirt, struggling. He said he's willing to offer you a relocation fee of $10,000 if you just sign the property over to him quietly. Richard and I think it's for the best. You can give us half for raising you, and use the rest to get a nice apartment." The silence in the cabin was deafening. The realization washed over Caleb like ice water. She hadn't called because she cared. She called because Hayes, knowing Caleb was a stubborn teenager, had found his weak point. Hayes had bribed his mother to manipulate him. The last fragile string connecting Caleb to his past snapped. "Daisy," Caleb said, his voice terrifyingly calm and deep, "do not ever call this number again. You don't have a son." He hung up the phone and threw it into the wood stove. Hayes did not wait for the week to expire. When he realized Caleb wasn't going to break, the intimidation began. Caleb woke up 3 days later to find the main irrigation valve smashed to pieces with a sledgehammer. 2 days after that, a strange chemical was poured into the small creek that fed his water supply, forcing him to haul water by hand from Silas's property. It was psychological warfare. But Hayes underestimated the resilience of a boy who had already lost everything. Desperate to find a way to fight the lien, Caleb began tearing the cabin apart, searching for any financial records Arthur might have left behind. He tore up the floorboards. He scoured the shed. Finally, in the cramped, bat-infested attic, he found a heavy iron lockbox hidden beneath a pile of rotting canvas tarps. Using his crowbar, Caleb snapped the lock. Inside wasn't money. It was a leather-bound journal, deeply stained with earth and time, alongside a stack of yellowed letters and carbon copies of bank statements. Caleb stayed up all night reading by kerosene lamp. The journal was a revelation. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just a farmer, he was a rogue botanist. The journal detailed decades of crossbreeding and grafting experiments. Arthur had spent his life cultivating a completely unique, hyper-resilient, incredibly sweet apple variety. He called it the Crimson Pendleton. It was a fruit that thrived in harsh frost and resisted local blights. More importantly, Caleb found the carbon copies of the bank checks. Arthur had paid off the loan to Hayes's father. He had paid it off completely, in cash and certified checks, a month before he died. The documents Hayes presented were a fabricated, incomplete ledger meant to steal the land from a dead man. But the biggest twist was yet to come. Attached to the final payment receipt was a letter from a university agricultural department. They had tested Arthur's Crimson Pendleton before he died. They declared it a groundbreaking, patentable cultivar. The trees outside weren't just an orchard. They were a gold mine. Hayes knew. That was why he wanted the land so desperately. The Oakhaven Town Council held a public meeting every first Tuesday of the month in the high school gymnasium. The entire town was there, including Silas, Clara, and Gregory Hayes, who was scheduled to present his proposal for the eco-resort, a proposal that conveniently included the imminent acquisition of Pendleton Ridge. Hayes stood at the podium, smiling slickly at the crowd. This development will bring jobs, tourism, and modern infrastructure to Oakhaven. And with the unfortunate but necessary foreclosure of the derelict Pendleton property next week, we can break ground by summer. The only thing derelict in this town is your fraudulent paperwork, Hayes. The gymnasium went dead silent as Caleb marched down the center aisle. He was covered in dirt, his knuckles were bruised, and he looked older than his 18 years. He slammed the heavy iron lockbox onto the council's folding table. "My grandfather paid your father back every single cent," Caleb declared, pulling the carbon copies and bank receipts from the box and sliding them to the town mayor. "And you knew it. You forged a ledger to steal my land because you found out what Arthur was growing." Hayes's face lost its color. "This is absurd. The boy is a delinquent, making up lies. I have the certified check numbers right here," Caleb interrupted, his voice echoing in the quiet gym. "And I have the university certification for the Crimson Pendleton cultivar, a cultivar that sits solely on my land. If you step foot on my property again, or if you touch my water lines, I will have the State Attorney General tear your development firm apart for fraud and trespassing." The mayor adjusted his glasses, looking closely at the receipts. He looked up at Hayes, his expression hardening. "Mr. Hayes, I suggest you sit down. Or better yet, I suggest you leave Oakhaven." The crowd erupted into murmurs, which quickly turned into applause, initiated by Silas and Clara. Hayes, realizing he was trapped and publicly exposed, grabbed his briefcase and hurried out the side doors, his pristine reputation shattered. Autumn returned to Oakhaven, exactly 1 year since Caleb had been thrown out of his childhood home. But this October was different. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and sweet fruit. Pendleton Ridge was unrecognizable. The trees, once skeletal and dead, were now heavily bowed under the weight of thousands of brilliant, ruby-red apples. The crimson Pendleton had blossomed just as Arthur's journal promised. Caleb stood at the edge of the orchard, holding a woven basket. He reached up and plucked one of the apples. He polished it on his flannel shirt and took a bite. The crunch was loud, the juice incredibly sweet, carrying a complex hint of vanilla and tart cherry. It was perfect. "So, does this mean you can finally pay me back for those pruning shears?" Caleb turned. Clara was walking up the dirt path, a warm smile on her face. Behind her, Silas was driving his tractor up the ridge to help haul the first commercial load. Local grocers and high-end restaurants from Seattle were already engaging in a bidding war for exclusive rights to the rare apples. "I think I can manage that," Caleb smiled, handing Clara a bright red apple. "And maybe that coffee, too." He looked back at the cabin. It was small, but it was warm. He looked at the orchard, at the life he had pulled from the dead earth. He had arrived as an abandoned, discarded boy. But through the dirt, the sweat, the betrayal and the fight, he had forged his own roots. He wasn't left behind anymore. He was exactly where he belonged.